And we're back with our world lead on the campaign trail. Donald Trump called it a terrible deal and promised to toss it out. And in May, President Trump announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, the agreement that established curbs on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. So now, at midnight tonight, the first wave of U.S. sanctions on Iran will be reimposed at 12:01 a.m. Joining me now to discuss this and more about President Trump's foreign policy, President Trump's National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
So the president has said as recently as this weekend that he's open to meeting with Iranian leaders. Earlier today, you told Fox News that the Iranian leaders, quote, flatly turned him down. They aren't serious about stopping their malignant behavior. A couple hours ago, however, the Iranian president said of a potential meeting, quote, if there is sincerity, Iran has always welcomed dialogue and negotiations. I don't have preconditions. If the U.S. government is willing, let's start right now, unquote. What's your response? Does that satisfy you?
Well, let's see what really comes of it, or whether it's just more propaganda. I mean, I think President Trump has been consistent since his days on the campaign trail that he would sit down and negotiate with Kim Jong-un, with the Ayatollahs in Tehran. That's his approach to diplomacy, and he's, as I say, been consistent on it. So if the Iranians are really willing to come and talk about all of their malign behavior in the region and around the world, I think they'd find the president willing to do it. But once again, this is a question less of what their propaganda is and what their real intentions are.
Let's talk about the reimposition of sanctions. As you know, the EU and the German, French, and UK foreign ministers said today that they deeply regret the U.S. sanctions coming back. It continues on to say that the Iran deal, quote, is working and delivering on its goal, namely to ensure that the Iranian program remains exclusively peaceful, as confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency in 11 consecutive reports, unquote. Now, you and I have discussed this before. U.S. sanctions alone will not change Iran's behavior. You need the EU and the European allies, to say nothing of the Russians and French. When I asked you in May if the U.S. would punish countries that continue doing business with Iran, you said it was possible. Any decisions on that?
Well, the issue here is what sanctions the United States is going to put back into place. And there's no doubt, and there shouldn't be any doubt in anybody's mind, particularly in Tehran, that we're going to put all the sanctions back in as they were before and more, to put really the maximum pressure that we can on the government of Iran, unprecedented pressure, and we're prepared to carry through on that. We've been, in the last 3 months since the president announced his intention to get out of the nuclear deal, we've been in near constant communication with our friends in Europe and around the world, urging them to join us, because we have a fundamental disagreement on the efficacy of the deal. We are in complete agreement that we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, and we're in complete agreement we want Iran to stop its ballistic missile program, stop its support for terrorism, and stop its belligerent military activity in the Middle East, none of which Iran has yet been prepared to do. But let me just say one other thing with respect to the statement of the three European governments. Their major businesses are already making the decision about what they're going to do in response to the reimposition of American sanctions. And in overwhelming proportions, they're deciding they'd rather do business in the United States than in Iran. And European businesses are terminating their activities in Iran to a very considerable extent. That's what adds to the force of the reimposition of U.S. sanctions, that European companies would prefer the United States to Iran.
But as you know, it took years and years of sanctions from not just the United States, but from all of Europe, from Russia, from China. I mean, it really took a world effort to get the Iranians to the table to begin with. Now you're talking about trying to get them to change the behavior with just a fraction of that.
That's just not true. It's not just a fraction of that. Moreover, what the Iranians did with great success over an extended period of time was mitigate the effect of successive ways of marginally incremental sanctions by hunkering down and by other mechanisms. I think the reimposition of American sanctions caught them unawares. I think their economy was much more vulnerable. We can see significant evidence of that. Number one, the value of the Iranian currency has fallen through the floor. It's lost more than 2/3 of its value since the first of the year, a good part of that in the last 3 months. Second, there's been extensive public reporting of large amounts of funds, dollars, euros, other currencies being shipped out of Iran by the Iranian elite. They can see the country's in significant economic trouble, and they're abandoning ship. And number three, right up until the present day, we've seen continued demonstrations, even riots in cities and towns all across Iran as the economic situation worsened. So I think our reimposition of sanctions has already had a major effect.
International observers say that Iran is complying with the original nuclear deal, as you know. On the other hand, U.S. intelligence agencies say, according to the Washington Post, that there's evidence suggesting North Korea is working on one and possibly two liquid-fueled ICBMs. Secretary Pompeo just testified that North Korea continues to produce fissile material, yet the Trump administration seems much more willing to engage with North Korea and not Iran, even though North Korea seems the worst actor when it comes to a nuclear weapons program. Why?
Well, I just think you've characterized that incorrectly. The concern about Iran and North Korea really goes together, since we know historically they've worked together on ballistic missiles, which is the delivery system for both of them for nuclear weapons, and quite likely worked together on the nuclear side, as the reactor being constructed in Syria by North Korea, destroyed by the Israelis in September of 2007 showed. I think the response to the administration to both Iran and North Korea is exactly the same. Maximum pressure on both governments to give up their pursuit of deliverable nuclear weapons, but a willingness to talk to their leaders to see if there's a way out. I think we're entirely consistent.
Last week, I want to turn to Russia if we could. Last week, you were among the top national security officials who came out to the White House briefing room to make a show of force to speak directly about the Russia election interference threat, how it continues today. President Trump has not been able to do the same thing, not in front of the world when he was in Helsinki, not since, not at any of his rallies, not when the press is in front of him, not on Twitter. Why not? Why can't President Trump condemn Russian election interference with the same vociferousness that you're able to?
Look, that's simply inaccurate. The president has on multiple occasions, and I'd be glad to give you a list so that you could see it, said that he agrees that the Russians have meddled in the elections in the past and that he's worried about it in the future. And I might say the very fact that I and the four of the heads of the operating department and agencies charged with detecting and preventing Russian meddling went out was due to his decision. He heard a version of those briefings at a National Security Council meeting the week before. He felt that the administration wasn't getting the word out to American voters, that we were concerned and were determined to protect the integrity of our electoral process, and were determined to counter Russian and other foreign influence campaigns. So he wanted the people to go out and tell what they were doing in a non-classified form, to be sure. So he knew exactly what everybody was going to say, and he wanted the American people to hear it.
So you were asked recently about when President Trump called Russian election interference a hoax, and you said, quote, "I think what he's saying by the hoax is the idea that somehow the Russians directed and controlled his campaign, or the Russians directed and controlled his administration, that there was some conspiracy or some violation of U.S. law in 2016. But if you look at the full tweet in which President Trump called election interference a hoax, it says, quote, "So President Obama knew about Russia before the election. Why didn't he do something about it? Why didn't he tell our campaign? Because it is all a big hoax, that's why, and he thought crooked Hillary was going to win." That's not about the Mueller investigation. That's not about collusion. That's about a Russian election interference and the president calling it a hoax. Are you not concerned at all when the president calls a threat to the nation that you obviously take seriously a hoax? Doesn't this undermine your very charge to these millions of voters who believe every word he says?
I don't see it that way at all. I think the distinction between Russian meddling, Russian influence operations, which let's face it, go back a long way. They go back in communist days to the Russians trying to take over Hollywood, which was a source of influence on the American people by taking control of the Screen Actors Guild and getting Ronald Reagan outraged enough to help stop it. That kind of interference has been going on for a long time. The issue for the president, I think, is the political argument made by his opponents that somehow he conspired with the Russians and they helped him defeat Hillary Clinton. That's what he thinks is the hoax. That's what I understand it to be.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
She didn't have to say a word.